Good evening and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and let's dive right in and study some Jewish history together. So we're picking up towards the end of the first decade of the young state of Israel. And as we've discussed, the War of Independence, while it gained independence for the country, it gained a larger swath of land for the country, it far from gained peace with its neighbors. And essentially, it proved to be true shortly after the war that Israel would be in a perpetual state of war. And as we see that for the first 4 decades of the country, there's a major war every 5 to 10 years. And we're now up to the Second Arab-Israeli War, also known as the Suez Crisis, the Sinai Campaign, the Tripartite Aggression, all the same names for the same situation. And there are a number of factors that led to the perspective of Israel in the war, in the world, and the situation of Israel in the world, that Israel be in a perpetual state of war with the Arabs. Probably the first person who we have to look at as causing this perpetual state for the Jewish people in the state of Israel was none other than Joseph Stalin, Yamach Shemo. He was definitely one of the greatest killers of the 20th century. I think in numbers outdid Hitler, not with Jews, but in numbers in general. And it's a toss-up if he or General Mao or Chairman Mao, achieved greater numbers of killings. But definitely one of the top two greatest murderers of the 20th century. And really, he just became crazier as he got older. And even though at the inception of the state of Israel, he was officially behind it, because then he thought it'd become part of the Soviet bloc and it'd become officially a communist country. But once it was clear that that's not what the country was going to become, that it was only to become mildly socialist, he took a 180 turn, and from that point on, slowly but surely moved away from the state of Israel. His latent anti-Semitism came to the forefront, and he moves closer and closer and closer to the Arab world, and gets to the point where he allies himself very close to the Arab world. So what happens because of that is the Arab-Israeli conflict, more than just being conflict between the Israelis and the Arabs, becomes really the front lines for the greatest proxy war throughout the Cold War. And we're going to see that with the Sinai Campaign, the 67 War, the 73 War, they're all going to, for the most part, be proxies between America. I shouldn't say for the most part. A large part of these wars is going to be proxies between the Soviets and the Americans as one of the fronts of the Cold War. So we can really look at Joseph Stalin and the Soviets and the Cold War as one of the main causes of keeping, at least initially for the first few decades, keeping Israel and her neighbors in a constant, perpetual state of war. Now, within the Soviet Union, as Stalin is moving more and more towards obvious and out anti-Semitism, he has all of the Jewish communist leaders killed. Towards the end of his life, there's something called the Doctor's Plot, where he alleged a conspiracy against a number of Soviet medical specialists that they were trying to murder different Soviet officials. And he has 37 doctors arrested, many tortured. And it's a whole plot that gets discovered after, that by the way would have been carried out if it wasn't for Stalin having the misfortune of passing away in 1953. But had he lived a few days, weeks, months longer, the plot would have been carried out, and it would have been seen as a great purge of Jews throughout the Soviet Empire. So that's, a big part of all this. The propaganda against Israel just increased throughout the Soviet Union during this time. Now, the other thing that happens is the sympathy of the war, the sympathy of the world had abated by this point. The world was very sympathetic coming out of the Holocaust, going into the establishment of the state of Israel. But, Israel had the misfortune of winning the war, which, had they lost the war, they would have had the great sympathy of the world and been dead. But the sympathy of the world at this point was gone. And from this point forward, we see the world is not really sympathetic towards Israel at all. And a lot of the latent anti-Semitism in many of the countries of the world start to come out. As early as December as early as 1949, we have the beginning of anti-Israel resolutions in the United Nations, and that only continues until today. The UN has passed more resolutions against Israel than any other country of the world, as if the state of Israel is the great pariah of the nations of the world. And that starts really in 1949 when there was a resolution to essentially be a throwback to the partition plan, which said that in the partition plan that Jerusalem should be an international city. And there were, in the United Nations, there were 38 votes for this, there were 14 against, and 7 abstentions. Most of the Catholic, Muslim, and communist states voted for this. And Canada, Costa Rica, Denmark, Guatemala, Iceland, Israel, Norway, South Africa, Sweden, Turkey, United Kingdom, and the United States, Uruguay, and Yugoslavia all vote against. And Jordan was also opposed, but they voted together with the other communists. With the other Arabs. But this is the first of a long string that of the United Nations being the most anti-Semitic body and functioning in the world today. I mean, it's, I always refer to them, they're not the United Nations, it's the useless nations, and it is a anti-Semitic body through and through and through. Now, the other big factor at this time that sort of fans the flames and keeps the perpetual state of war is the government in Egypt. After the War of Independence, Farouk, the extremely corrupt, probably one of the most corrupt Arab leaders of all time, and that's really, topping that list is not a small feat. But none other than King Farouk was, after the War of Independence, it really exposed a lot of his corruption because the Egyptian military realized just the corruption that was going on, how 1 in 3 rifles didn't fire, and how all the corrupt arms deals led to them having a dysfunctional army and losing that war. And therefore, there's a military coup in the country. Farouk was overthrown, and the leader that comes to power is a man by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now, Nasser himself was really conflicted. It seems like early on was conflicted with two positions. One was that, okay, they should make peace with Israel, they should modernize Egypt, they should move on from, they should move into the sphere of influence of the West, of America, and that would be the best place for Egypt to find itself. The other conflicting idea he had in his mind was the idea of pan-Arab nationalism that he would talk about. He would talk about there being one Arab kingdom, one Arab country, stretching throughout every Arab country of the world, and of course he would be the one in control of it. And to this end, he renamed Egypt the United Arab Republic, and Syria, we're going to see for a period of time, actually comes under the rule of Egypt, and that's sort of the conflicting ideas that Nasser has going on in his mind and in his actions. Now, he realizes that in order to achieve any sort of pan-Arab nationalism, he had to take a strong stance against Israel because, as history has proven, any Arab leader who takes a moderate stance against Israel ends up paying with his life. As we'll see, King Abdullah I of Jordan, Anwar Sadat of Egypt, this was their fate. And, you wonder why more Arab leaders don't want to make peace with Israel. But that's the situation with Nasser. Now, another thing that was nagging at Nasser is he wanted England out of Egypt. England was still present in Egypt at this time, even though Egypt was a free country, but they controlled the Suez Canal, and that not only was an affront to Egyptian nationalism, but also was an affront to the pocketbook of Egypt because it was England that was collecting all the fees for the Suez Canal. So Egypt was basically pitting itself in this Cold War struggle in between Russia and U.S. and trying to figure out who was going to be their sponsor, who was going to be their advocate, and help them get rid of England was a big part of that. Now, to this end, to a lot of these ideas of Nasser wanting to nationalize the country, Nasser wanting to be patronized by either the U.S. or the Soviets, he came up with the idea of the Aswan Dam. Now, the Aswan Dam was a dam that was, the goal was to dam up the Nile River to, in part, control the flooding, which when it was just right, it was great for the economy and the crops and the farms of Egypt. When it overflowed too much, it could kill all the crops. When it didn't overflow enough, it was also a problem. So part of the idea was to be able to control the flow of the Nile for the sake of the waters that provided. Beyond that, it was a whole system of hydroelectric power that was supposed to be developed. And it was this great grand idea that it's kind of questionable if it's even played out like that. But But Nasser was led to believe that the U.S. was going to sponsor this project, and sort of in the 11th hour, the U.S. pulls out. So in his rage, he turns to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union couldn't have been more obliged to jump right in, sponsored the building of the Aswan Dam, became the patrons of the Aswan Dam, became the patrons of Egypt, in so doing moving Egypt, and with it, the Arab world closer and closer into the Russian sphere of influence, making it the line of scrimmage for the Cold War. Beyond this, he went on, Nasser goes on to nationalize the Suez Canal. He throws out the British. And, the British acquiesced because they couldn't fight at that point. Their empire had been destroyed in World War II. I think we mentioned this before, that Churchill had said all along that the empire would be preserved, and that's what he was fighting for, but it wasn't. And, they hadn't recovered economically. Their military for sure hadn't recovered. And there's no way that Britain could militarily challenge Nasser at this point, so they just picked up the marbles and went home, and essentially ending the British presence in the Middle East. They're not in Israel anymore. They're not in Jordan anymore. They're just about out of Iraq, and now they're out of Egypt. And, Britain wasn't too happy about this. But what happens at this point, now that he looks like he's had a string of successes, he looks like the powerful man in the Arab world, he's thrown out the British, he's built the Aswan Dam, he's got Soviet weapons, he's got Soviet military advisors, and he turns his attentions on to Israel and starts threatening to rectify the wrong that was done by Farouk and the wrong that was done by the Israelis and the Westerners, and begins with a concept that really exists until today of fedayeen, or terrorist. He starts sending these little troops of terrorists into Israel. They'll bomb a school, they'll come back to Egypt, Israel will retaliate, and all along the strategy is to do just enough to terrorize the Israelis, but not enough to warrant a war between the Egyptians and the Israelis. So Egypt will promote these little attacks, Israel will retaliate, and of course after Israel retaliates, they get, they have their fingers waved out and they get shunned by the United Nations and resolutions as those disproportionate response. And, that's how the story goes. Now, beyond this being done by Egypt, it's also being done in Syria. We see the Syrians are shelling from the north. We see the Egyptians are sending in the fedayeen in the southwest. And we have the Jordanians in Jerusalem who are sniping over the wall at West Jerusalem. And it's, not a pleasant situation for the young fledgling country of Israel. Now, beyond this, we have these are just the enemy from without, but the struggles from within are still very ripe and very difficult. Now, the big struggle at this time is the question of German reparations. There was one camp that said, okay, we know Germany's guilty. They're willing to pay reparations. We need the money. Let's accept it. And, at least they should have to pay something. That was the camp led by Ben-Gurion and his Mapai allies. Begin and his allies and his Likud, what becomes Likud allies, were completely opposed to this. They said, what, you're going to let Germany off the hook? You're going to let them pay for our blood with money? And he was vehemently opposed to it. And it almost brings Israel to a civil war. We see that Begin stands up in the Knesset, and he threatens, he says, at the time of the Altalena that we discussed, I think 2 weeks ago, he said, I told everyone to put down their arms. This time I'm going to say to fight. We're going to surround the Knesset, and over our dead body will the state of Israel accept German reparations. And Begin is suspended from the Knesset for this. It's actually interesting. Until Begin comes to power, he has set the record for the most suspensions from the Knesset. And Israel almost comes to its knees and comes to a state of civil war over this. But in the end, Israel does accept the reparations, and to the tune of about $14 billion. And a lot of that comes in the form of a lot of equipment. All the trucks in Israel until this day are Mercedes. All the taxis until this day are Mercedes. That's why you see so many of those white Mercedes in Israel today. They're all paid for by the German government, and it ends up happening. But what's interesting is the only country to pay reparations to the state of Israel is West Germany. East Germany doesn't pay a penny, Poland doesn't pay a penny, Lithuania doesn't pay a penny, Latvia doesn't pay a penny, etc., etc., etc. All these other countries that were, willing, were compliant and willing to go along with German control and the Holocaust and the anti-Semitism and the extermination of European Jewry, they don't pay a penny. But West Germany, they stand up and try and rectify the wrong. So it's just, it should give us pause that that's what happens on the world stage. Now, in 1953, we have another sort of shakeup in the Cold War situation, that there's a split between Yugoslavia and the Soviets, and Yugoslavia seems to kind of jump out of the Soviet bloc, and this leads Stalin to instigate a wave of purges across the Communist Party leadership and throughout the Soviet bloc. And one of the places where this comes into play is in Czechoslovakia. Now, Czechoslovakia had a Soviet leader by the name of Rudolf Salansky, who was born Jewish, and Salansky is put on trial. Is put on trial for being basically pro-Yugoslavian, for not being Soviet enough. And also part of the trial is put on trial for being a Zionist. And in 1941, Slansky and 14 Czechoslovakian leaders are arrested. There's a show trial in November 1952. He's charged with high treason, and after 8 days, 11 of the 14 were convicted and sentenced to death. Rudolf Slansky was executed 5 days later. In an act of out-and-out anti-Semitism. And that's what it was. It was anti-Israel, anti-Semitism. There was no arguing, no qualms about it. Now, at the time, Israel protests to Czechoslovakia, and Russia takes this as a diplomatic affront. The next thing that happens to stoke these flames of the Cold War is that there was still, the Lehi, the Stern game was still somewhat active in the land of Israel, and there was a group of members from Lehi called the Kingdom of Israel, and they were trying to carry out a number of attacks against different enemies of the state of Israel. And in February 1953, a member of this Kingdom of Israel group bombs the Soviet embassy in Tel Aviv to protest the Soviet anti-Semitism that's going on throughout the Soviet Union and the Communist bloc. It injures 3 people, including the Soviet ambassador's wife, and severely damaged the building. Now, the Soviets at the time cut off diplomatic relations with Israel as a response. So you see how the fire is just getting fanned and flamed and fueled from left, right, and center. Now, all of this made it more and more likely that at some point Egypt was going to invade Israel. They had the help of the Soviets. They had Soviet strategists. They had Soviet weapons. And it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. Now, the intelligence that Israel had was that the Soviets wouldn't be ready for war until 1957, 1958. So the idea was to try and have a preemptive attack in 1956 to stay that. Okay, one other interesting thing that goes on in the world at this time is that we have King Abdullah I in Jordan. Now, Jordan was an interesting situation because even before the War of Independence, they were the most moderate of the Arab nations. And there are even secret meetings between Golda Meirson, a.k.a. Golda Meir, and King Abdullah before the war broke out. And, it's unclear what exactly was agreed upon or discussed or proposed in those meetings. There's different accounts. We don't know for sure. But it looks like there was, an attempt at a reconciliation, basically saying that if Jordan would stay out of the War of Independence, Jordan would get the partitioned areas of land that had been partitioned to the quote-unquote Palestinians. So we know that happened, and in 1949, after the War of Independence, we know that Abdullah enters secret peace talks with Israel, including at least 5 people, together with Moshe Dayan, military governor of West Jerusalem, and other senior Israeli officials. Now, news of these negotiations provokes a strong reaction from the Arab states, and especially from Nasser, and Abdullah agrees to discontinue the meetings in return for the Arabs agreeing to recognize Jordan's annexation of the West Bank. Okay, now The problem is, Abdullah in many ways already tainted himself with these overtures to the Israelis. So on the 16th of July, 1951, Raid Bey al-Sol, who was the former prime minister of Lebanon, was assassinated in Amman. And the reason he was assassinated was because rumors have been circulating that Lebanon and Jordan were discussing joint separate peace agreements together with Israel. And 96 hours later, on the 20th of July, 1951, King Abdullah, leaving the Al-Aqsa Mosque after his Friday prayers, was shot to death by a Palestinian. So, you see what happens in the Arab world is a clear message to any potential moderates that you try to make peace with the Israelis, we're just going to knock you off. That's what happens to King Abdullah, and that's what eventually will happen to Anwar Sadat about 30 years later, 25, 26 years later, 27 years later. Okay, so this is the situation. The shelling continues from Syria. The Fedayeen attacks continue from Egypt, and Israel, retaliates and then gets censured by the United Nations. Now, the next provocation of Nasser is that he closes the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. That meant that Israel, in order to get goods to Europe, instead of going through the Straits of Tiran from the port of Eilat up through the Straits of Tiran through the Suez Canal to Europe, would have to go all the way around, basically all the way around Africa to be able to try and get to Europe. Obviously a very, very, very difficult journey by ship in those days and even today. So that's considered sort of the provocation of Nasser. And he's going to do this several times. He's going to do it before the Six-Day War, but the closing the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Now, at this point, we have Britain, who's been embarrassed already by the Egyptians. We have France, who's basically being embarrassed by what happened to them in World War II, by their lack of success in North Africa with their Arab provinces. And they were basically anti-Arab at this point as well, and are going to eventually be driven out of North Africa through these struggles. But both France and Britain were looking for a win, looking to save face, looking to make themselves somehow look like a military power once again. So basically, you have this group of bedfellows, Britain, France, and Israel, all of which, Britain and France want the quick victory. They all want to get rid of Nasser, but no one wants to get rid of Nasser more than Israel, who naively thought if they could get rid of Nasser, then, they could have some peace in the Middle East. So with the knowledge that they had that that Egypt was not quite ready for the war that they were talking about, they wanted to have a preemptive strike that could hopefully knock off Nasser and hopefully prevent a more major war. Now, beyond this, in 1956 is an election year in America. And Eisenhower, they figure Eisenhower is distracted with the presidential election, so therefore, because he's distracted with running for re-election, he would not, say anything about Israel and what they were doing. Now, beyond this, we had a short Hungarian revolution that happened, where Hungary for 2 weeks successfully breaks with the communist bloc. They end up getting invaded by the Soviets and have to come back. But between what's going on in Hungary, between the presidential election in America, Israel, France, and England together, the tripartite together thinks that the world is too distracted and therefore won't care about what's going on in little old Israel and Egypt. So the premise was that Israel would invade Gaza and the Sinai in order to destroy the Fedayeen that had been attacking into Israel, in order to open up the Straits of Tiran, in order to avenge the affront that Nasser made in closing the Straits of Tiran. And their hope was that in doing so, they could topple Nasser. Now, the concept was they would invade, they would get all the way to the Suez Canal, and then at that point, Britain and France would call for a ceasefire. Israel would ignore it, and so too would the Egyptians, of course. And then Britain and France would come in as the peacekeepers. They would paratroop into the Suez Canal. They'd force both Israel and Egypt back 20 miles or so from the Suez Canal, once again internationalizing the Suez Canal and hopefully doing enough damage to topple Nasser. That was the cockamamie bird brain idea. Somehow they thought they would keep their scheme secret from the world, and somehow they thought that this would work. Well, what happens is Israel goes in with tremendous success in the Sinai, through Gaza, through the Sinai. In 4 days, it gets within 18 miles of the Suez, and England and France call for the ceasefire. It's ignored. They send paratroopers in, pushing back the Egyptians. The Israelis just go back at that point. And at this point, what happens is Russia warns Israel to stop and threatens Israel with the use of its missiles if they don't get out of the Sinai. Now, before the Egyptians are pushed out of the Sinai, out of the Suez Canal, Nasser scuttles 40 ships in the canal, closing off the canal for over a year to international shipping, so now no one could use it. And in an interesting twist of events, Eisenhower takes a moment away from his presidential campaign to join the Russians and their demand for Israel, England, and France to withdraw from the Sinai. They press the issue in the UN, and all three have no choice but to leave Sinai with their tail between their legs. And the results of this is Nasser's made even more of a hero in the Arab world, because here he stood up to England, he stood up to France, he stood up to Israel, he had the UN on his side, and he's made more of a hero. He has more Russian backing than ever before, and he is stronger than ever before. Israel at least got some promises from the UN that the UN would put peacekeeping troops into the Sinai, that they would have the use of the Suez Canal, that the Straits of Tehran would be open to Israeli shipping, and basically Nasser doesn't honor any of it. And what can Israel do? They can't go to war again. It was already shown that the closing of the Straits of Tehran were not enough to go to war. So what are they going to do now? Israel's able to keep the UN's able to keep the Straits of Tehran open until '67, but the Suez Canal we see is going to be closed, and is still going to create much hardship on the Israelis. Part of the aftermath of this is that the British Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigns, and it just strengthens Nasser in the world. Now Nasser does get a few dings in his armor after this. He gets entangled in the Yemenite war against Saudi Arabia. He goes in, he sends troops against Saudi Arabia, and that doesn't look too good. Like, there's one thing when he's fighting the Israelis, the British, and the French, but when he's fighting other Arabs, that doesn't play too well into his goal of pan-Arab nationalism. And then he also, for about 5 years, takes over Syria, which also doesn't bode too well with a lot of the other Arab powers. So, it does get a few dings of his honor, but that does nothing but serves to embolden him more for the eventual war, which doesn't come about in the late 50s, but will come about in 1967, which we'll discuss in a few sessions from now. But this is the Suez Crisis, the Sinai Campaign, and really was, as Ben-Gurion recognized afterwards in a very honest account, was a complete misstep. It was a cockamamie idea, a harebrained idea, and never should have happened, and it really didn't do much to help out Israel. It just further embarrassed England and France as well, and further drove Egypt and the other Arab powers into the Soviet sphere of influence. And God willing, we'll talk about this more in the coming sessions. I thank you so much for coming. I thank you for listening. Have a wonderful week, and we'll talk to you more next time.